This is Lecture 63A that accompanies Chapter 67 in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018. That's Chapter 67 on New Zealand in Volume 4 on Communism and Oceania. And I'll just start out with some contemporary demographics. In June last year, that is 2016, New Zealand had a population of 4,693,000. Europeans are the largest of the major ethnic groups with 2,609,592 people, or 67.6% of the population. The Maori ethnic group is the second largest with 565,329 people, or 14.6%, followed by Asians at 9.2% and non-Maori Pacific Islanders at 6.9%. Now, before we get to the primitive communism, let's take a look at New Zealand's geology. New Zealand is part of a submerged continent that broke away from the Gondwana supercontinent millions of years ago. And as this new land moved into the Pacific Ocean, it gradually submerged and then was uplifted by tectonic crustal activity. Its geology is noted for volcanic activity, earthquakes, and geothermal areas, all because of its position on the boundary of the Australian plate and the Pacific plate. Now, much of the basement rock of New Zealand was once part of the supercontinent of Gondwana, along with South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, Antarctica, and Australia. The rocks that now form the continent of Zealandia were nestled between eastern Australia and western Antarctica. Throughout the last glacial maximum, that is 22 to 20,000 BP, global sea levels were about 430 feet lower than at present. And at North Island, South Island, and Stewart Island, these were all joined together. Now, temperatures dropped by about 4 to 5 degrees centigrade. Much of the southern Alps and Fiordland were glaciated, but the rest of New Zealand was largely ice-free. The land to the north of Hamilton was forested, but much of the rest of New Zealand was covered in grass or shrubs. New Zealand suffers from many natural hazards, including earthquakes, volcanic and hydrothermal eruptions, tsunamis, landslides, and floods. The most severe earthquake was an 8.2 event in the Wairarapapa in 1855, and there were 261 deaths then in a 7.8 earthquake. And Hawke's Bay in 1931, another in 2010. There was widespread property damage caused by 7.1 earthquake, and in 2011 there was a 6.3 aftershock at Canterbury, which measured 7.1, and the 6.3 aftershock of 22 February 2011, the 2011 Canterbury earthquake, in other words, resulted in 185 fatalities. And in 2016, the 7.8 Kaikoura earthquake killed 2 people in the remote Kaikoura area southwest of Christchurch. So, you can see this is a pretty active place. The most severe eruption since European times is the Taro Root eruption of 1866. However, there are many potentially dangerous volcanoes in the Taupo volcanic zone, and even a minor eruption at Ruapehu could cause a loss of electricity for Auckland due to ash on the power lines, and in the Waikato River, stopping the generation of hydroelectric power. Much of the North Island is steep and composed of soft mudstone known as papa. That easily generates into landslides. Parts of New Zealand, especially Northland, Coromandel Peninsula, the Bay of Plenty, Gisborne, and the Manawatu can have high rainfall that can generate flooding on farmland. Now, in terms of animal resources, New Zealand has always been an extremely noisy place. Large tracts of lush native bush support an incredible variety of bird life, and these birds make a lot of noise. So, as they evolved, however, the wings became unnecessary for some of the birds as they had no natural predators to flee. Therefore, several of the New Zealand's native birds became flightless, including the kakapo parrot, the kiwi, the takahe, and the world's largest bird, the now extinct moa. As Maori and Europeans settled New Zealand, they hunted birds and brought predators including rats and stoats. This and loss of habitat led to the extinction of a number of birds, including the moa and the huia. Now, in terms of native birds, the kiwi is New Zealand's national symbol, and it's a nocturnal flightless bird with nostrils at the end of its large beak. The kiwi is now endangered and difficult to see in the wild. However, there are a number of kiwi houses, as they're called, at zoos and wildlife parks. While they may look cute, kiwi can be fierce and they are territorial. So there are some other well-known New Zealand native birds, and I go ahead and mention them and describe each of them. I won't do that here. It's in your book when you get it. In terms of marine life, New Zealand has abundant and diverse marine life. Whale watching and swimming with dolphins are two most highly recommended experiences according to locals. The small Hector's dolphin is the world's rarest dolphin and is only found in New Zealand waters. Seals, penguins, and a whole host of fish and shellfish also thrive in New Zealand's fertile marine environment. Over 20% of New Zealand is covered in national parks, forest areas, and reserves, and these are the best places to observe native fauna and flora. The mainland has two World Heritage Areas, Tongariro in the central North Island and Te Waiponamu in the southwest of South Island. For a look at native sea creatures, one can visit any one of New Zealand's 34 marine reserves, or all of them, I suppose, if you wanted to. A strict no-take policy operates in these areas, which means no fishing or gathering of seafood. These underwater wonderlands, which include the world-renowned Poor Knights Islands, are enjoyed on boat cruises today and on diving or snorkeling trips. The reptile tuatara is a unique relic of the past and is the only beak-headed reptile left in the world. Each species of this reptile family, except the tuatara, died out in the asteroid impact 66 million years ago. Tuatara can live for over 100 years and are only found on protected offshore islands, and they are no threat to humans. Now, in terms of plant natural resources, New Zealand's high rainfall and many sunshine hours give the country a lush and diverse flora, with 80% of flora being native. New Zealand has majestic evergreen native forests that include rimu, totara, and many varieties of beeches, and the largest native tree of them all, the giant kauri. Underneath the trees you'll find a dense and luxurious undergrowth including countless native shrubs, a variety of ferns, and many mosses and lichens. The yellow flowers of the kauai tree are some of the prettiest you will ever see, and if you visit the North Island, you will not be far from the beautiful pohutukawa tree. Its bright red flowers bloom in December, making it New Zealand's Christmas tree. The ancestors of the Maori brought edible plants from their homelands, and this includes kumara, which is a sweet potato, yams, taro, and tipori, or cordyline fructicosa, a species of what they call cabbage trees. In Aotearoa, that is prehistoric New Zealand, the climate was significantly colder than that in which these plants had evolved. The Maori developed sophisticated techniques for adapting them to the new environment, and they were cultivated in huge communal mara, that is gardens, sometimes with gravel, sand, shell, and charcoal added to the soil. Plants were also grown using hue, or gourds, as containers. Now, some native trees, flax, and flowering shrubs were brought into cultivation closer to human settlements to attract birds. Many stands of the native cabbage tree, tikoka, that is Cordyline australis, can still be seen in the bush where they were once deliberately planted. Captain James Cook described Maori gardens he saw on his 1769 voyage to New Zealand as, quote, "The ground is completely cleared of all weeds. The mold broke with as much care as that of our best gardens. The sweet potatoes are set out in distinct little mole hills. The arum, which is what he called taro, is planted in little circular concaves exactly in the manner our gardeners plant melons. The yams are planted in like manner with the sweet potatoes, the kumara. These cultivated spots are enclosed with a perfectly close fencing of reeds about 20 inches high. New Zealand was originally covered with dense native bush, and its ferns, vines, palms, fungi, berries, fruit, and seeds became important foods for the indigenous people. Ruhe are the rhizomes of the bracken fern Pteridium esculentum, and were especially important to the Maori. 18th century botanist Joseph Banks wrote that it was the foundation of their meals. Now, in terms of animal resources, the Polynesian rat and the Polynesian dog, Kiori and Kuri, respectively, were valuable and highly regarded food sources. So if you have been developing a taste for rat and dog food, you might want to head over there to New Zealand. The huge flightless birds known as moa were hunted for meat until their extinction. A wide range of other birds were caught, including the weka, the wood pigeons, or kiraru, the tui, the hui, the native ducks, native geese, takahi, and numerous seabirds. The oceans, lakes, and waterways provided fish, seals, whales, dolphins, shellfish, crustaceans, and more, and these became especially important after the extinction of the moa. Eels were abundant in many parts of the country and were prized for their eating qualities. 10 varieties of shellfish were and still are consumed. These include species of tuatua, tohera, pipi, twangi, pau, kina, titico, mud snails, pupu, cat's eyes, and cuckoo or kakahaim or mussels. Fishing was largely a male activity, and shellfish gathering was traditionally a job for women. In 1769, on Captain James Cook's first voyage, the scale of tribally organized fishing impressed his naturalist Joseph Banks, who described seeing a large Maori fishing net which was 5 fathoms deep, and its length we could only guess, as it was not stretched out, but it could not from its bulk be less than 400 or 500 fathom. He went on, fishing seems to be the chief business of this part of the country. About all our towns are abundance of nets laid upon small heaps like haycocks and thatched over, and almost every house you go into has nets in its making. In terms of food gathering, each tribe had its own named fishing grounds and diving rocks protected by mythical guardians called kaitiaki. These sites were very important and in some cases sacred or tapu to the tribes, which relied on them for their survival. In the 21st century, many Maori continued to catch their local delicacies at these sites. Maori drank fresh water and, for medicinal purposes, tonics made from seaweed, berries, fruits, and leaves steeped in water. They used no alcohol or tobacco and did not regularly consume any stimulants, although special plant concoctions are known to have been drunk by warriors preparing for battle. Now, from primitive communism through the Chiefdom Transition. In AD 1288, archaeological and linguistic evidence proves the initial settlement of New Zealand. Humans emigrated from Taiwan to Melanesia and then traveled as east through to the Society Islands, Polynesia. These people were the last stages of primitive communism. Bone and rat-gnawed woody seed cases of Wairau Bahar, New Zealand's only prehistoric site, provide this date for the earliest archaeological site and the beginning of sustained anthropogenic deforestation. The descendants of these settlers became the Maori people. These original settlers were of the advanced Paleolithic type of broad-spectrum, wild resource land and marine exploiters. In 2 centuries, they drove some abundant large game, such as the flightless bird moa, to extinction. In areas where it was possible to grow taro and kumara, that is, sweet potatoes, they built the tribal agricultural stage. Everywhere but the south of the South Islands was where they cultivated the wild plant Fern Root and the Cabbage Trees. Now, the kumara has a long history of cultivation in New Zealand. It was brought here by the early Maori settlers over 1,000 years ago from the Pacific Islands, and they were widely grown, especially in the semi-tropical region of the North Island. The Maori managed kumara growing with great horticultural skill, making use of the ideal growing climate and controlling kumara caterpillar with the use of tamed black-backed seagulls. Kumara caterpillar could devastate a crop almost overnight, hatching in their thousands. So pre-European Maori grew several different varieties of bush kumara, but compared to the varieties we eat today, they were very small in size, being no bigger than a finger. The kumara we eat today has evolved from larger South American varieties that were brought out to New Zealand from the 1850s on whaling ships from the Americas. The local Maori and early settlers saw the good characteristics of these varieties and quickly adopted them. Now, in terms of taro, that is a perennial tropical plant primarily grown as a root vegetable for its edible starchy corm and as a leaf vegetable. It is a food staple in African, Oceanic, and South Indian cultures and is believed to have been one of the earliest cultivated plants. Taro root comes from the taro plant, which is native to Southeast Asia and India and is a staple in diets there, as well as in Africa, China, the Caribbean, and Hawaii. Both the big green leaves of the plant and the root itself can be consumed when cooked. In their raw form, however, both are toxic. There are lots of varieties of taro, from small to large, from white flesh to purple flecked ones. It's most commonly used and prepared much like a potato, as it's equally starchy and similar in flavor, with taro taking on a nuttier, richer, and more complex taste overall. Compared to a white potato, it has 3 times the amount of fiber and is also a rich source of potassium, iron, vitamin C, and vitamin A. The culinary uses for taro root are endless. It's cooked up in various savory and sweet ways around the world. The popular Hawaiian dish poi is simply mashed taro root and is eaten alone or as a side dish for meat. As a general rule, treat taro root like you would a potato, or sweet potato roasted, boiled, simmer, mashed, or fried. The fern root. Now, fern eating in particular, the consumption of bracken fern roots is and was a characteristic of Maori, M-O-O-R-I, subsistence in Aotearoa, in contrast to the diets of Polynesians residing in the tropics. In 1925, Elsden Best described how the abrupt change from tropical conditions forced early Maori to collect wild foods. Even when cultivation of kumara and taro were established, quote, it became necessary to still rely on fern root as the principal vegetable food supply in most districts, unquote. Now, the overall impression that bracken fern root consumption was a Maori innovation went unchallenged, while later writers only debated the relative contributions of cultivated crops and bracken fern root. There were oceanic precedents of fern eating, and whether our attention has been too narrowly focused on bracken fern root to the neglect of the roles played by other fern species in Aotearoa is another matter that will require further analysis in the future. It will never be known exactly how many species were used. It is, however, worth reviewing some early records to appreciate the range of species familiar to the Maori and the relative importance of some of the key species. The European perception that the rhizomes of the bracken fern, Pteridium esculentum, were the Maori equivalent of bread, was formed during the first onshore encounters between the two peoples in 1769. The role of the bracken fern root was certainly magnified by the season, which was when first contact was made, that is in spring and early summer, when the sweet potatoes was unavailable. Now, by visiting the drier eastern locations of the North Island first, the Endeavour's botanists did not have a chance to see the extensive fern flora of western rainforests and could not compare how Maori used these species relative to bracken. Also, the role of bracken fern root was assessed against the diet of another Polynesian culture encountered on the well-endowed tropical island Tahiti, where cultivated tree and root crops provided most of the vegetable food. Now, in terms of the cabbage trees. The cabbage tree or cabbage palm, Cordyline australis, is a widely branched monocot plant tree endemic to New Zealand. It grows up to 20 meters, that is 66 feet tall, with a stout trunk and sword-like leaves, which are clustered at the tips of the branches and can be up to 3.3 feet long. With its tall, straight trunk and dense, rounded heads, the C. australis is a characteristic feature of the New Zealand landscape. Its fruit is a favorite food source for the New Zealand pigeon and other native birds, and it is common over a wide latitudinal range from the North Island to from far north of the North Island at 34 degrees 25 minutes south to the south of the South Island at 46 degrees 30 minutes south. Absent from much of Fiordland, Maori probably introduced them to the Chatham Islands and to Stewart Island. In AD 1500, the Maori settled the tiny Chatham Islands in the east of New Zealand. These settlers produced the Maori People, and here they grew cabbage trees, and today they grow in a broad range of habitats. These include forest margins, river banks, and open places, and they are always abundant near swamps. The largest known cabbage tree with a single trunk is growing at Pakawao, Golden Bay, and is estimated to be 400 or 500 years old and stands 56 feet tall with a circumference of 30 feet at the base. Known to the Maori as Te Koka, the tree was used as a source of food, particularly in the South Island where it was cultivated, where other crops would not grow. It provided durable fiber for textile, anchor ropes, fishing lines, baskets, waterproof rain capes, cloaks, and sandals. Hardy and fast-growing, C. australis is widely planted in New Zealand. Gardens, parks, and streets, and numerous cultivars are available. The tree often used in island restoration projects such as Tiri Tiri, Montanga Island, where it was among the first seedlings to be planted. Now we come to the simple and advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Leadership was based on a system of chieftainship. In time, the egalitarian selection of chiefs became hereditary. Male and female chiefs had to demonstrate leadership ability, and like pirate captains, chiefs had to fight contenders or be replaced. The toughest chiefs had a built-in incentive to pay supporters and achieve a more permanent status. The most important units of Maori society were the Wanao extended family and the Hapu, a group of Wanao, were the major societal units. One or several of these would evolve into permanent bodies of armed fighters. And iwi was the Maori word for the tribe or simple chiefdom. It consisted of groups of hapu. Some hapu conducted the iwi trade. Others conducted major projects. As the internal contradiction of the Maori simple chiefdoms matured, internal and external conflict became common, and the stage was set for the invention or acceptance of a unifying religion, that is, for the emergence of the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. Traditional Maori society preserved history orally through narratives, songs, and chants, and skilled experts could recite the tribal genealogies, the Wakapapa, back for hundreds of years. Arts, including waikorero, or oratory, song composition in multiple genres, dance forms, including haka, as well as weaving, highly developed wood carving, and tamoko body tattooing. Maori culture was undergoing major socio-cultural evolutionary changes from tribal agriculture to simple and then the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage. This happened differentially from region to region, and inevitably, as the ATCs evolved, societal ranking produced chiefs fighting wars to consolidate their ruler status. Their desire for income increased competition for land and other resources. Income was essential for ruler support of permanent armed bodies of fighters, i.e. the state. The fortified pa became common. Pa remains today are remnants of Maori hill forts, appearing as lumps and bumps in the grass. Typical in simple chiefdoms and ATCs were kumara pits. These were holes in the ground used for storing kumara tubers over winter. These are the sweet potatoes, similar to the Tahltan fish storage pits above the Tahltan River in northern British Columbia we excavated in 1969. The only prehistoric archaeological site in New Zealand is Wairau Bar in Marlborough. It is the earliest known settlement in New Zealand. Here there are human skeletons, tools, cooking pits, jewelry, middens containing mussel shells and moa bones, and moa eggs that were used for carrying water, and much more. Local tribal elders subsequently reburied the human remains because ancestors are significant in Maori ideology. Taking a closer look at Wairau Bar, it is a 47-acre gravel bar formed where the Wairu River meets the sea in Cloudy Bay, Marlborough, northeastern South Island, New Zealand. It is an important archaeological site settled by explorers from East Polynesia who arrived in New Zealand about AD 1288. It is the earliest known human settlement in New Zealand, and at the time of the occupation, it is believed to have been a low, scrub-covered island 2 to 3 meters, that is 7 to 10 feet high, and 0.68 miles long and 0.25 miles wide. Therefore, Wairau Bar is one of 2 sites in New Zealand where researchers have discovered evidence of remains and artifacts that could be traced back to tropical eastern Polynesia. This link was discovered as the result of the agreement between Rangitain and the Canterbury Museum to return the bones of their tupuna that were taken from Wairau Bar by archaeologists. As a condition of their return, the museum asked that researchers at the University of Otago examine the remains because they found the bones of several tupuna who were not born in New Zealand but in eastern Polynesia. Now, the discovery had huge ramifications, as it meant that the Wairau Bar was potentially the first point of human colonization in New Zealand, and it's dated to AD 1288. The site was discovered in 1939 by then schoolboy Jim Isles, who in 1942 found more artifacts. Early investigations with Roger Duff unearthed a burial site, and bones were scattered in close to the surface. This was originally believed to have been due to plowing, but work by Bruce McFadgen shows that at some stage, probably between the 2 periods of occupation, the site was subject to either large storm surge waves or a tsunami, which probably contributed to the scattering. Using the techniques of the time, about 2,000 artifacts and 44 human skeletons were removed and examined in detail. The record shows that the partial skeletons of several children were found in shallow graves. These were in such poor condition and scattered that Duff kept the intact bones but not the fragments. His examination showed that the people were using the same cultural methods as those in particularly of the Marquesas Islands. 69 adzes were found at Wairau Bar, of which 3 were made of greenstone. 80 small one-piece triangular stone or bone fishing lures were lashed, unbarbed. Hooks were found also. Now, in terms of the skeletal analysis, in 2009, a more modern analysis by Buckley et al. Found that the skeletons had a wide range of estimated ages. None of the skeletons were from elderly people. The oldest was 39 and the second oldest was 36. Most of the skeletons were from people aged in their 20s. No children and only 1 teenager's skeleton was found. This is consistent with younger people being buried elsewhere, a practice that was quite common in the South Pacific. There was only 1 child's skeleton. The 21 skeletons with teeth all exhibited some developmental enamel disorders, showing they had suffered long, stressful periods during childhood, but survived to reasonably healthy adulthood. Tooth decay was rare, especially amongst males, a similar trait to Neolithic people of the North American Indians. Many of the skeletons showed multiple signs of stress, such as Harris lines on x-rays of long bones, such as the tibia, caused by either infection or a poor diet. Tooth wear was substantial among older individuals, with teeth worn to the roots, but this did not seem to be due to bracken fern root chewing. All the adults showed healed bone fractures, indicating a well-balanced diet and a supportive community structure. Several skeletons showed features that are interpreted as being caused by tuberculosis. The presence of TB was yet to be confirmed by DNA analysis in 2010. Anemia was common, as was arthritis. The average height of the males was 69 inches and the females 63 inches. These figures show the early colonizers were tall compared to most Polynesians. The skeletons were all found in shallow graves, with the heads pointing toward the east and the feet to the west, as was the practice in eastern Polynesia. The archaeological layers were shallow. The later 2009 to 2010 study, using more precise modern methods, resulted in the site being more accurately dated by radiocarbon to 1288 to 1300. The site appeared to be occupied twice over a period of about 20 years, which is consistent with information from other early Polynesian colonization sites in New Zealand. Accurate dates were obtained from moa egg fragments found in grave and midden sites. Buried with the skeletons were moa bone, reel necklaces, whole moa eggs used as water carriers, argillite adze heads, carved serpentine that looked like shark and whale teeth, harpooned heads, and tattooed chisels. A few nephrite, that is jade or greenstone artifacts were found. It's believed that the site was primarily a factory for making stone adze heads. It has been estimated from the adze heads found and the large area of stone flakes that about 12,000 adze heads were made here, or about 400 to 500 per year. Argillite, the most common adze head material, is hard compressed mudstone. It is found at D'Urville Island, only 62 miles away from Wairau Bar. A Maori argillite quarry is located in the hills behind Nelson City. Such large numbers of adze heads have implications about trade in the early Archaic period. One adze found in the 2009 study has been identified by archaeologist Richard Walter as Tahanga basalt from Tahanga Hill near Opito, a well-known moa hunting area. It was a quadrangular shape known as Type 1, identical in design to those used in the Cook Island at the same time, and also found were chert from Kaikoura, and that was commonly used for making holes. Pumice from the volcanic plateau was used as floats and for making small handheld fire bowls. A small amount of greenstone from the west coast was made into 2 adze heads, and this indicates that the Wairau moa hunters traveled extensively through New Zealand exploring the land. Adze heads are associated with shaping wood, especially in the making of waka. The stone head was lashed to an L-shaped natural crook and swung so the blade struck the wood more or less horizontally. An investigation by a team from Otago University found a huge stone-lined umu, or hangai, pit, that is an earth oven, 4.9 feet deep by 13 feet across, estimated to be big enough to feed 1,000 people by a local Maori familiar with modern hangai. However, these large hangai, or umu pits, were identified in 1968 in the Kermadex by Roger Duff as being typical Polynesian umu tea. The purpose of the large pit was to cook the taproot of the tea plant. This was a common method of reducing the tuberous root to a sugary pulp. The tea can be cultivated easily, but is slow growing. The root is about 35 inches long by 3.5 inches wide to its tip. It is cooked very slowly in an umu earth oven for 12 to 24 hours, and the plant is usually associated with the far north of New Zealand, but may have been grown further south during the warmer climatic period associated with the early Polynesian settlement. A geophysics study showed that the Duff Earth Oven Pit was only one of 6 such pits in a rough horseshoe shape on the edge of a lagoon. Now that study showed the site to be much bigger than previously thought, at least 27 acres, and possibly larger, as 2 boundaries have not been accurately plotted. At least 50% of the area was intact. By 2007, only 2% of the site had been scientifically investigated. Intact skeletons, many minus the head, were found in 4 groups, with the oldest being closer to the sea and at the western end of the site. DNA studies show them to be of people who had lived in East Polynesia. The largest group of skeletons, that is from 15 to 43, were in an area to the east which covered an oval area of about 98 by 164 feet. These people are believed to have been moa hunters who lived their lives in New Zealand based on bone and teeth DNA analysis. The main habitation area was central, about 82 to 164 feet from the southern lagoon edge. There were 3 zones of cooking and surface midden debris, all about 328 by 98 feet approximately. The earliest zone was alongside the lagoon, and the latter on the ocean side of the island. At the time of the second occupation of the island, the second site was protected from the ocean by a long and narrow boulder bank. There are 2 adze-making sites. One is adjacent to the early occupation zone, and the second is adjacent to the later burial site. The most intensely studied indicates a right-handed person sitting in the porch area of a small wharf. Now they sat in front of a flat stone on a path cobbled with the small round rocks, chipping off flakes of argillite with the hammerstone of quartzite. The limited studies done so far indicate a sizable village, and it's apparent that bodies were commonly buried about 200 feet from the cooking and working zone. And in terms of how they exploited the fauna, after being used for cooking, each umu had subsequently been used as a midden. The bottom layer of the midden showed that at the very earliest occupation time, shellfish, such as mussels, were much larger, averaging 9.8 inches long. The lower layers of the midden also showed that early moa bones were not smashed to get at the marrow, as was common in the upper layers. Whale bones were found in the lower layer. Mainly moa leg bones were found, indicating that moa were hunted inland and brought to the site for cooking. Bones from all 5 moa species located in the upper South Island were found, as well as the remains of numerous butchered moa, seals, porpoises, the extinct Haas eagle, Isles harrier, New Zealand swan, and the New Zealand raven, the Maori dogs, kuri, the tuatara reptile, kiore, shellfish such as pipi, papua, cockles, and marine bones from eels, skate, sunfish, and sharks. All there. Now, Anderson Smith in their 1996 study stated that the first colonists enjoyed a sustained assault on the local megafauna. At the time of the latest investigation, the local Rangitane iwi reburied 60 skeletons claimed to be their forebears in a formal ceremony at the lagoon site. Now, there is a shell link to East Polynesia. A study of turret shell artifact completed in 2011 shows a direct link between the Wairau Bar site and East Polynesia. This is only the second artifact found in New Zealand originating from East Polynesia, dated to the early Polynesian colonial period. The other was dug up 60 years ago and is the early East Polynesian pearl lure found at Tairua, identified by A. Powell of the Auckland Museum. The shell tool is a modified spiral gastropod shell. These tools were used as small chisels or gouges, possibly for enlarging holes. The point of the turret shell was removed and the remains honed to a chiseled point of about 60 degrees by grinding. Although found in various East Polynesian islands, the most common site by far is Whalea, Ruahine in the Society Islands, where many have been located from the same period. There is a 2012 study of DNA, and its results are as follows. Dr. Lisa Matisu Smith and Dr. Michael Knapp from New Zealand's Otago University have released the results of a recent bone and teeth DNA study carried out on early Polynesian migrants to New Zealand who lived at Wairau Bar between AD 1285 and 1300. The results of DNA analysis reinforce the idea that some of these people were original settlers from East Polynesia, as they had a very different diet based on soft starchy food. The 2 other burial groups showed a very different diet that is more varied and consistent with having been raised in New Zealand. Scientists found that there was a wide range of DNA mutations indicating that settlers were part of a reasonably large group. This indicates a planned migration rather than isolated random groups. One of the mutations was associated with insulin rejection, as found in type 2 diabetes. This reinforces the mathematical modeling done in the past that shows the same pattern. Work has begun to trace the East Polynesian populations that have the same DNA mutations in order to discover the specific homelands of the Wairau Bar settlers. The DNA pattern is very similar to that found in the Marquesas Islands in East Polynesia at the same time. Now, New Zealand's sea mammals were another important source of protein. And that brings us to a conclusion of this first lecture on primitive communism and the Chiefdom Transition in New Zealand, with a little introduction to the geology and the fauna and flora of New Zealand.